Hi everyone, welcome to our brief lecture. Well, I always say brief, but they're never quite so brief, are they? So let's try this again. Welcome to the lecture video on stress and psychological health. In this video, I'm just going to cover on a very basic level some things that are included in your reading, but also provide a little bit more information to provide, as always, hopefully a good foundation or jumping off block for you to continue your studies in this week's readings. I want to start with this claim that stress is both good and bad. A famous stress researcher has said that stress is the salt of life, meaning it is necessary for our life. I have a picture, for instance, here of a young girl who's not so young anymore, but this was a picture of her when she was young. Her name's Gabby. She has a very rare condition where she does not experience pain. Now, when she was born, her parents at first glance thought, well, isn't this a great thing? How much time do parents spend trying to help their children avoid painful things? Don't touch this, don't go that, watch out, be careful for that, right? And now they don't have to worry so much because their child doesn't experience pain. But very quickly they discovered that quite the opposite was true. That without the experience of pain, Gabby led a life that was very dangerous. She bumped into things. This is why she has glasses on, because she would her eyes could very easily be injured as she would poke them and bump into things because she didn't experience pain. She broke many bones in her body, had all kinds of injuries, because pain, in a sense, is a warning for us. It tells us what we should avoid. And when we get injured, we then, if we learn well, know not to do those kinds of things again. Without that reminder, Gabby had a hard time navigating her world in a way that didn't leave her injured. Stress, in a sense, is the same kind of thing. Without stress, we wouldn't know what's meaningful, what's important. We wouldn't be motivated to pursue things that might be challenging or outside of our comfort zone. So on one hand, stress helps us accomplish things that may otherwise be or feel impossible. And yet we know that there is a quote-unquote bad side of stress. Particularly prolonged or chronic and extreme stress can start to deteriorate much of our brain and our body. There are full body consequences, negative consequences of prolonged and chronic or severe stress. So it is a balance, and it looks something like this. If you look at performance and kind of achievement on one axis and stress level on the other, you can see that there's quite a bit of stress that is what we would call eustress, which is good stress that leads to high levels of performance. You might think if you're an athlete or musician or even had any kind of big event like a public speaking engagement, if you don't have any stress, it's probably because it's not all that meaningful. There's not a whole lot to win or to lose. But if you have a little bit of stress that can provide you the kinds of psychological and physiological resources that you need to conquer. However, there is this line to where if you cross that, it becomes distress, where your performance level goes down. And again, you start to see this psychological and physiological deterioration, particularly over time. So when we think about stress response, why do we have that kind of optimal or eustress aspect of levels of stress, and then the distress? Where does that come from? Well, there's been this general adaptation syndrome, the GAS model, as a proposed way that we respond to stress. As you see here, when a stressor comes into our life, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but what are stressors? It's some kind of event, either a psychological event or some kind of environmental event that signals that there is some kind of threat. Whether that be a good threat, like this is a really important football game that's coming up, or a bad threat like there's a tiger in the woods. This stressor occurs and it mobilizes our body. Physiologically, we have this very strong and immediate response where all of our resources are mobilized. If you can think about a stressful event and imagine what your body felt like, you can feel it, right? You can feel blood flow moving. You can feel your heart rate increasing, things starting to come on board, and some things like digestion starting to go off board. This is so that your body is in optimal condition to fight the stressor, to flee from the stressor, or sometimes to freeze from, in face of the stressor. So we are able to resist really well, whether it be to fight off infection, again, perform well on stage, or run from or attack a lion that's chasing us. Now, the problem is that if we exist in this time for too long, our body just can no longer sustain all of those resources. And so phase 3 here is exhaustion. We become depleted of all of those resources. And we can have this is when we have all of the very negative consequences, particularly if we have resided in this phase 2 for a long period of time. Now, this model works really well and has worked really well evolutionarily. If we think about times like our ancestors, evolutionary ancestors, or even other species, let's say on the plains like this, when there is a threat, your body is mobilized and you can run or deal with that threat very, very well. The problem is that in our modern world, we have threats everywhere, and we often perceive threats that aren't really threats. They're as if there's kind of this proverbial bear in the woods or lion in the bush everywhere we go. We can imagine them. And then there are real, not lions necessarily, but there are real threats that happen again and again and again. Not so much, again, the lion in the bush, but we have deadlines and traffic and real oppression and marginalization and all kinds of things that are constant. And so we then end up existing in this phase 2 for long periods of times with a body that has not yet adapted to that kind of world. Furthermore, because of our modern world, we don't often end this stress response cycle. So if you think about that zebra being chased by a lion, if it gets away from the lion, as you see it here in this picture, it can end that stress response cycle of stressor and response, and now it can start to relax. And if you've ever had a very stressful experience where that stressor ends, like let's say, be in a car accident, have an injury, even something good like getting married or having a baby, you can sometimes have a very strong physiological response. If you see people in those kinds of circumstances, or even watch a zebra after it's fled from a lion, its body will sometimes shake as everything is being relaxed. It's been so tense for a period of time that it starts to shake as it releases all of those endorphins and starts to rest. And then it's prepared to start that cycle again. In our modern world, we don't often have ends to stressors, especially in this time now where it seems like there's so many unknowns, so many things that are unpredictable and unexpected. And so they are just always hanging over us, and we can never really wrap up that cycle. And that has some long-term consequences as we're always existing in phase 2. So one of the assignments that you'll do for this week is to watch some information about how we can close this stress response cycle and how beneficial that can be for our own psychological and physical health and well-being. Now, at one other point I want to make that I hope will help in your own stress experience and kind of recovery is that we often exist thinking that a stressor leads to a stress response, right? So COVID-19 and all of the things about it has happened, and that causes stress. Think back to what cognitive behavioral or cognitive therapies thinks, that there's something in the middle, that the activating event does not lead to the emotional experience. But really what happens is our belief system about that event disrupts that, and can change our emotional response. So in other words, our thoughts can change our stress response. So this is a model for the stress response, that we have a stressor, again, a psychological stressor, things that we can be thinking about, worrying about, or something from the environment can happen. That doesn't immediately cause that GAS, or stress response. Instead, what happens is we begin to appraise the stressor. So we think, is this a challenge? Is this a game that I need to be on my kind of top of my game, in other words, for? Is this something where this experience that I'm feeling, this kind of physiological arousal, is actually just preparing me for this stressor? Or is this stressor a threat? Is it threatening my well-being? So perhaps it's going to make me late. It's a challenge, like a difficult assignment. It's a loss of a job, so loss of income. It's a threat of a loved one's or my own health or well-being. And if it's a challenge, we see that as a place for potential growth. Now, there's a lot of research here that says we can actually reframe things to think about them as challenges instead of threats. And perhaps this is our first place where we can begin to change our coping and actually change the way in which we experience stress. So this is malleable. This is changeable. Now, if we see that stressor as a threat, this is where it can start to lead to some negative outcomes, particularly if it's long-lasting. But we make a secondary appraisal here, and then if we see it as a threat, we begin to ask ourselves, and many of the times, by the way, this is unconscious. We don't have these kinds of conscious conversations with ourselves, but we should, because if it becomes conscious, then we can have control over it. The secondary appraisal is where we ask ourselves, what are my resources like to address this threat? And you can imagine someone could have the same stressor, like the loss of a job. And if someone has all kinds of resources, sure, that could still be a negative thing. It can still cause stress, but you can see how it might not be as stressful as someone who loses a job and doesn't have a lot of resources, such as perhaps savings, skills to acquire a new job very quickly, opportunities for new jobs with living wage, family support systems, and so on and so forth. And so depending on whether or not you feel like you have or you do have the resources, you will see this as either a low threat and experience less stress, or a high threat and experience more stress, meaning your body will go into a higher state of alarm, and then the risk of exhaustion and depletion is even greater. Now, this model looks great, and I hope that you think about this and apply it to your life, because we have stressor after stressor after stressor after stressor. And so it's not just kind of a one-time thing, right? Each stressor we go through this paradigm or this model with. So I hope that you will think about your own life and try and navigate that and rethink some stressors that you're experiencing. I also want you to think about some of your own biopsychosocial spiritual factors and how you can promote some of these to, again, increase your coping ability with those stressors, as well as your well-being. This, again, is a big term, biopsychosocial spiritual. Everything we've talked about in terms of psychology has been talked about through this model or through this lens, that we can't separate biology from psychology, from our social experience, from the spiritual, that when we talk about human behavior, all of these things come into play. And so when we're talking about stress, all of these things come into play. All of these things impact our ability to cope with and manage stress. In some ways, we don't really know how. And then could it be that, for instance, people who are clinically depressed, could it be some genetic factor that's making them less able to cope with stress as well? Could it be that as part of depression, they're often isolating themselves or being isolated from others? We know that social engagement leads to better coping of stress. So these are very complex and multifaceted. Your text talks about all of these. that all of these things are important for mitigating stress or better coping with stress. Some of these you don't really have much control over, like type A or type B personalities. We think that personality is somewhat genetic. So while you might be able to become a little less type A, you're probably always going to be type A. Some of these, however, you do have control over. A sense of control. Even if you were in a circumstance where you have very little control over your environment, you can always control something. You can always control the way that you approach it in your mind. A really great example of this and some great psychological theorizing came from Viktor Frankl, who was who was a Jewish man in a concentration camp. And he wrote and theorized about psychology and well-being from these concentration camps. You can imagine, if you've read anything about concentration camps, people had very little control over their circumstances. Almost every part of their independence had been taken from them, but he argued we still could sing. And even if we couldn't sing out loud, we could sing in our mind. We could still remember things. We could still think about our ways with certain perspectives. And although all of those things may have been more challenging than ever, he said no one could take those things from us. And in many cases, that's what allowed some to live and others to perish. One thing I do want to focus on that we all have control over is taking a optimistic or pessimistic perspective over the things around us. Again, we cannot control everything, but the way in which you look at things, the way in which they're perceived has a strong impact on your psychological health. Again, this is kind of the psychological immune system. This is a way that we can bolster up our immune system, just like taking vitamin C, for instance, for our body. And this is something we can change. Although most of us have kind of a natural propensity to being either a pessimist or an optimist, this is something that through practice we can change, right? We can cultivate and harness aspects of happiness and well-being. And why should we do this? Because pessimism has been related to higher levels of stress, higher levels of chronic stress, and because of that, higher risk and incidence of heart disease and heart attack. So let's focus on something that we can change. How do we change it? Well, first of all, optimists tend to use these natural stress coping mechanisms. They tend to engage more readily in relaxation techniques. They tend to promote and value relaxation techniques, taking time to journal, to write, to paint, to meditate, to deep breathe, to exercise. They tend to also engage in what we call downward social comparison. So instead of doing upward social comparison, where you're always comparing to people who have more than you, are better off than you, are happier than you, they sometimes will focus more on downward social comparison, focusing on kind of the silver lining of things, that this may be difficult, but it's better than this, right? It could have been that. Look at these individuals who have so much more to deal with, or so much more to suffer through. Now, just an aside, I wouldn't recommend offering this to other people if they're not ready for that. It can be very dismissive of their own experience and their feelings. So really this is something to cultivate in yourself and perhaps model, but I wouldn't offer it to someone who's really struggling to say, oh, why don't you just think about all the people who have this, you know? It's not all that effective. And then alternative thinking. Again, I'm going to give you some specific examples of how do we do this. We tend to get, particularly pessimists, tend to get in this negative spiral of thoughts about how bad things are, how bad things will be, and just worrying, and what we call perseverating, going over and over again, ruminating on these bad things. The first thing to do is to stop yourself and to recognize that that's what you're doing. Sometimes other people have to call you out on this, and so you pause and you say, I am really obsessing over these negative thoughts, or I'm just in this rut. Stop, notice it. Then distance yourself from that and say to yourself, these are just thoughts. This isn't the way the world is. This isn't necessarily the way the world is going to be. These are just ways I'm thinking. And then begin to argue with those thoughts. Say, these thoughts are not helping. It's important to have them without judgment. Allow yourself the opportunity to have them, but then move from them. Reframe them. Again, focus on that silver lining. You're not ignoring the cloud. This isn't sweeping things under the rug. This isn't being Pollyanna and just putting on blinders to the realities that are difficult or challenging, but instead focusing on the things that you can control. There is a saying in Buddhism. Buddha said that we cannot control the arrows that come at us, but we can control the second arrow. And often that second arrow is turned inward on ourselves. Blame, guilt, shame. And then we make things worse. Again, thinking back to cognitive theory for treatment and therapy, right? Or we can turn that arrow and shoot it at other people, and that doesn't necessarily make things better. So focus on the things that you can control, and these alternative ways of thinking can help you become more optimistic. The other things that you can control are behaviors that can promote stress, coping with stress. So as a part of our assignment for this week, we're going to engage in at least one of these stress management techniques. There are all kinds, free and readily available all around you. And being very intentional and mindful about doing these things. I added one here, unplugging from electronic devices, particularly social media. Even just putting a phone out of your sight can reduce stress. So there are tangible things that we can do to cope with stress when we can't necessarily get rid of that stressor. One of the things that a lot of research has focused on recently, this has been an ancient technique, but it's now been scientifically studied and has shown all kinds of incredible benefits, is mindfulness. This is kind of a thinking technique. Some call it a meditative practice. It is certainly a practice. This is not something that you can do overnight. There is an example in the bottom of your textbook where there's a 5-minute mindfulness practice. I encourage you to take advantage of that. This isn't about creating a full mind. If you can think back to the podcast and the module that we did on language and cognition, where we have that mind chatter, remember the woman's experience when that chatter was gone and how kind of relaxed, almost euphoric she described her existence? This is what mindfulness is about. It's about recognizing that chatter, slowing it down, and being present of yourself. Kind of these grounding exercises where we get ourselves out of our head and ground ourselves to our lived experience, our feet on the floor, our breath expanding our lungs, our blood warming our body, and how beneficial that can be in engaging the parasympathetic nervous system to slow us down, to relax us, really reset and ground us. So I look forward to you having the opportunity to read more about, learn about stress and how to cope with it, how to engage in a happier life. And then I even more so look forward to the opportunity for you to practice it. Take care, everybody. I hope just now you take a deep breath in through the nose and out through the mouth, and let's move forward to become less stressed, more engaged with the world around us, and just have a happier and more fulfilled sense of purpose and well-being. Happy learning, everybody.